Today I want to talk about something I'm calling Aspasius' paradox. It's really about the concept of virtue, and so we could view it as a potential elaboration or even criticism of Aristotle's theory of virtue. I think it's important to talk about this because many contemporary philosophers, and it's crept into our general conception of virtue, think of virtues as means between extremes. It's really the chief thesis that Aristotle advances about virtue, and it's shared by Confucius and a variety of other authors. But Aspasius is raising some interesting questions about it, and he draws a distinction. It's rather implicit in his commentary, but it becomes more developed in later commentaries that are inspired by him. And so there are several things I want to discuss, and maybe a good way to start is with the question of perfect virtue. What is a perfect virtue? Well, Aristotle barely uses the term at all. It appears in a few places, but in contexts where it just seems to mean, well, someone who is completely virtuous. And so it's not really any distinct kind of virtue. For example, he says at one point, since happiness is an activity of soul, in accordance with perfect virtue, we must consider the nature of virtue. Perhaps we'll thus see better the nature of happiness. So really there he's just thinking of happiness as this perfect, complete state, and it involves perfect or complete virtue. There are a few other places where he talks about perfect virtue. For example, there can be no honor that is worthy of perfect virtue. But really there is no theory of this. That's about all we encounter in the Nicomachean Ethics. And so it's something that, well, commentators are left free to talk about as they want, more or less. Now, the commentator I want to focus on today is Aspasius. Aspasius wrote the earliest surviving commentary on Aristotle. It's on the Nicomachean Ethics. He apparently wrote other commentaries of other works as well. And it's hard to say exactly when he lived. Jonathan Barnes, I think quite reasonably, hypothesizes that he wrote his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics around the year 131. Probably about 50 years old then, so he may have been born somewhere around the year 80 and lived, well, hard to say, but perhaps to 150. In any event, Aspasius was an early commentator of Aristotle, somebody who writes sympathetic to Aristotle's positions and in general trying to advance an Aristotelian line. His student, Alexander of Aphrodisias, became the best-known commentator on Aristotle, and in fact was often referred to simply as the commentator. Galen was a student of Aspasius, and so his influence was felt really throughout the next millennium. He was perhaps the beginner of a tradition of commentaries on Aristotle, which was a dominant way of thinking about philosophical questions for 1,000 years. Now, I want to talk about a couple of the ideas that Aspasius advances in contemplating Aristotle's theory of virtue, specifically virtue as a mean between extremes. The first question that I want to consider is the question of whether virtue, if it is a mean between extremes, should be viewed as a point or a region. Is it, in other words, like, well, in Aristotle's examples, one specific point? For example, 6 is halfway between 2 and 10 in one of his examples. And so that's one possibility. It is a point. There is one way of doing it, one way of getting things right. And indeed, Aristotle often talks that way. In fact, that seems to be the dominant way that Aristotle discusses the notion of, well, being a mean between extremes and so being a virtue. There is only one way to get it right. Let's take a look at some examples. He says in Book 2, if it is thus then that every art does its work well by looking to the intermediate and judging its works by this standard, so that we often say of good works of art that it's not possible either to take away or to add anything, implying that excess and defect destroy the goodness of works of art while the mean preserves it. And good artists, we may say, look to this in their work. And if further virtue is more exact and better than any art, as nature also is, then virtue must have the quality of aiming at the intermediate. I mean moral virtue, for it's this that's concerned with passions and actions, and in these cases there is excess, defect, and intermediate. For instance, both fear and confidence and appetite and anger and pity and in general pleasure and pain may be felt, both too much and too little, and in both cases not well. But to feel them at the right times, with reference to the right objects, towards the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way is what is both intermediate and best. And this is characteristic of virtue. Now notice that he says this is analogous to works of art where you can't add anything or subtract anything and have it still have excellence. And similarly, he says it's a matter of doing the right thing at the right times with reference to the right objects, toward the right people, with the right motive, in the right way. And so we are talking about something that seems to be one way of doing things. He goes on to say, it's possible to fail in many ways, while to succeed is possible only in one way. For that reason, one is easy and the other difficult. To miss the mark easy, to hit it difficult. For men are good in but one way, and bad in many. That image of an archer aiming at a target is something that Aristotle uses repeatedly throughout the Ethics in thinking about the nature of virtue, and in general in thinking about the nature of right action. We are like an archer shooting at a target. The point is to hit it right in the middle of the target, to hit the center. And there's only one center. Now, if you think about actual archery targets, there isn't really just one point at the center. After all, hitting one point would be enormously difficult. However, there is a very small region. And so that raises, in another form, our question. By using that archery image and thinking about aiming at a target, is there really only one way of hitting the target? Aristotle says several times that that's right. There's only one way of doing it. But you might think, well, what's really appropriate to that is hitting that center region, not just one point at the very center of the target. After all, we count an archer as having succeeded if they've hit that center region. Aspasius, on the mean. Aristotle says that erring is possible in many ways, but being correct in one only. That erring is possible in many ways. The Pythagoreans too bear witness when they say that evil is characteristic of the unlimited, but the good is characteristic of the limited. This is why erring is easier, for it's possible for someone who is shooting to miss the target to the right and to the left and above it and below. But one does it correctly by hitting the target, and it's possible to hit the target in one way only. From this it is evident, then, that excess and deficiency are characteristic of vice, whereas the mean is characteristic of virtue. For the mean is one, but excess and deficiency are two modes of vices. Further, in each excess, it's possible to be excessive in many ways if the excess is intensified and slackened. Similarly, in each deficiency, if the deficiency is less or more. But it is possible to be correct in one way only, in accord with the mean, for the mean is one. Well, if all of that is right, then we do have to ask the question, should we take seriously the mathematical analogy that suggests there really is only one way of getting things right? Or should we adopt this somewhat more permissive conception of thinking that, well, it's difficult, but there is a region. For example, somebody is upset. A friend, let's say, comes to you with a problem. They're upset. Is there one and only one thing you can say that is the right thing to say? Well, I guess on one view, yes. But from another point of view, you could say, no, there are many ways of saying something that's a right thing to say in that situation. Notice I said a right thing rather than the right thing. And that is, in another form, our question. When we're faced with some kind of puzzling circumstance and we have to act, is there a right thing to do or is there the right thing to do? Is there one and only one action that will really count as virtuous?